it's on the table. Peter.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for the invitation to speak to the organizers, and thank you very much also to Vijay Mehta for your book. I would like to start by saying that I fundamentally sympathize with the choice of the theme of your choice to focus on the military-industrial complex in the year 2012. I remember times very far in the past in the Netherlands when some sections of Dutch politicians used to address these themes, and some academicians as well. But the whole thematic having been wiped out from the discourse in the Netherlands, I think it is highly welcome, your effort to re-put the theme on the debate, on the table for debate. I'm very happy that we have this occasion in the Netherlands also to get it back in public discourse. What I've done to prepare for this event is first of all to reflect how can I somehow contribute sensibly to a very rich book which Vijay Mehta has written, and I decided ultimately to focus on three themes. The first one would be the thematic, the conceptualization of the military-industrial complex, which there is a long history, which the complex has a history which I think can be perhaps stated a bit more elaborately in support of Vijay Mehta's discourse. The second theme I'll briefly refer to is the wars in the Middle East. And some of the data, in support of some of the data, I'll refer both to the case of Libya as well as the threatened war against Iran. And in the latter part, I will refer to the question of conversion, which I also think we need to get back on the table for discussion. So let me start by referring to the theme, the main theme of your book, the military-industrial complex. And of course, the author of the book is very right in referring back to the speech by President Eisenhower made when he made his farewell speech, in which he stated his concern, his warnings that there existed a close nexus between the immense military establishment of the United States and the large armament industry, and called on the American public to be vigilant against acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the MI6. So I think this is definitely a historic reference point, which has ensured that for a certain period, in the past at least, the thematic of the military-industrial complex was almost part of the regular discourse in the United States as well as in Europe. Now, how to look back on the construction of a military-industrial complex in order to understand the mechanics of this system? In my view, the history of the formation of a military-industrial complex has to be dated actually to the period of the later part of the 19th century and the period when Great Britain was actually the hegemonic power in the world system. It is in that particular period, in particular in the aftermath of what was called the Naval Defence Act of 1889, that the British government undertook a number of policies which paved the way towards the first initial military-industrial complex in a Western society. One of the steps that the British government took at the time was to increase its reliance on private corporations, from previous reliance primarily on the arsenal, on public companies. The British government in this period sought to strengthen the possibility of privately owned corporations to supply the British Army with weaponry, and it provided its orders to a very selected number of corporations. So this is the very first feature which characterizes the military-industrial complex. Alongside that, during the very same period, we see a shift from inventions made primarily by individuals in the field of military technology towards a takeover by the state of the role of promoting research into the innovation of military technologies. Now this is, say, the initial period for the formation of a military-industrial complex. Now we get to the case of the United States, where we see a far more consolidated effort during the Second World War and afterwards to form a military-industrial complex with which we are faced up to today. What happened during the Second World period? And it's very good to look back at the details of what happened, because it explains very clearly why Eisenhower got scared at the end of his own presidential period. During the Second World War period, the United States government instituted several committees to oversee the supply of material for the waging of war, of the Second World War. And one was, of course, the War Production Board, but the other one is perhaps even more important, namely the Service Supply Committee, in which there was direct cooperation between corporate chiefs on the one hand and generals of the US Army. So it's through actually the military effort during the Second World War that we see the nexus becoming very concretely formed within the US economy. On the one hand, you have a strong military establishment, but on the other hand, that military establishment has very close interconnections with the armament industries. And at the same time, we see also a repetition of what happened during the history of Britain, namely that the orders for armaments were placed with a very selected number of corporations within the US economy. I could cite a large number of data to underline the point. I mean, there were something like 100 top private military corporations which received no less than 2/3 of the 175 billion in prime contracts. So there was a very limited number of corporations that actually were put into the position of the prime supplier. And this has been the feature of the functioning of the US military-industrial complex up to today. Now, of course, this power structure bypasses the truly democratic decision-making. And that needs to be kept in mind when we discuss the implications of the system. Because of the formation of such a powerful nexus of interests at the top level of the US economy, it is very difficult, even for an American president, to bypass the interest of the military-industrial complex. And I'm going to illustrate that perhaps a bit further, but let me at least cite a few data on the size of military allocations and its impact today on the US economy. There's a lot of confusion as to the exact size of US military allocations, but according to my data, the size of these allocations are definitely no less than 1 trillion US dollars, so een biljoen in Nederlandse termen, 1,000 billion US dollars, which we can divide into the official military budget, the budget for war allocations, as well as a large number of hidden allocations under other denominations. I'll not elaborate here in this part of my speech on the application of the term military-industrial complex to other cases. In the book, it happens that also China is highlighted as a case of a military-industrial complex. Europe is. What I would perhaps should add, at least, is that there we see the initial formation of a military-industrial complex in Europe, at least on 2 counts. One is that the European Union is seriously trying to centralize research relating to weapons inventions, and which is definitely a sign that they are aware of their interest, or a European interest, in formation of such a complex. At the same time, we see, similar to the US, that there has been the formation of a Europe-level military sector where we have integrated, powerful corporations dominating the whole structure. I'll leave it at this for the first point. The second point, Europe's hypocrisy in relation to the Middle East. I was very happy with many of the details that you cited in your book on European efforts to promote the sale of armament systems to Middle Eastern states. And I would like to start this point in my speech by referring to the example you mentioned of David Cameron's visit to Egypt, which is definitely a very, a very striking instance. It is in the aftermath of the uprising of the Egyptian people for democracy that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he travels to Egypt and takes along representatives from 8 military arms suppliers, including not just BAS, but also Thales, in fact representing the incipient European military-industrial complex. So the example of Cameron's visit is indeed very, very important. At a time when the Egyptian people seek recognition for their democratic aspirations, when the army has taken power, Cameron doesn't go to Egypt to show his support for the Egyptian people. No, what he goes to do in the Middle East, in Egypt as well as in other Middle Eastern states, is to promote the interest of European armament corporations. It's very clear from this example. Now, how should we visualize the structural relationships between European armament corporations and Middle Eastern oil-rich states? I find the next example that Vijay mentions also quite important. He refers to the case of France's supply of armaments to the Gaddafi's dictatorship in the period before the fall of Gaddafi, so up to 2011. And what he mentions in the context of Libya is a double connection. You have Mirage jets being sold to the Libyan government, and as well as an agreement by France to refurbish the rest of Libya's air force. That is one side of the picture. But at the same time, we see that French corporations provide access to Libyan oil, which then subsequently will be imported into Europe. And the case that is mentioned in your book is very significant. Total's investments in Libyan oil representing a significant percentage of Total's total investments of oil. Now the picture could be perhaps stretched a bit further. If you look at the data regarding arms supplies by European states toward the Middle East, as well as the data on imports of oil towards European nations in the period since the lifting of the oil embargo, of the armaments embargo in 2004 by the European Union, we clearly see the double connection. Because it's not only the case of France that is very striking, it's striking that both in the case of Italy, in the case of Italy as well, we see this double connection. And it's very interesting to cite here from some of the data that have been published in the British Guardian, which show very clearly that double connection. Since the lifting of the arms embargo, the EU granted export licenses for 834.5 million worth of armaments exports for European countries. And if we see the breakdown for those exports, we find that Italy and France have the major share in that, Italy being responsible for the sale of armaments worth to 276 million and France 210 million. So that's the primary share. And the same is true for the oil. The oil imports primarily go to France and to Italy. So we can speak, in fact, of a trading mechanism. And I've done that in my book a bit elaborately, because what we don't generally realize that there is in place, and consciously in place, a trading mechanism that connects actually the two, that connects the exportation of armaments from Western countries to the Middle East with the importation of oil from the Middle East to the West. In his speech, Vijay Mehta has correctly referred to the very important El Yamana deal between Great Britain and Saudi Arabia. And he refers to the corruption scandal where Blair helped to cover up the scandal. In fact, it was a scandal where one of the princes of Prince Andrew came in all out to denounce the investigation itself. So you see the nexus between, as well as also between the dynasties, very strongly. Now, what is important about this deal is not only that that's a case of corruption. In fact, the whole deal epitomizes the whole trading mechanism, because it was a barter deal. It was a deal in which directly it stated in the agreement between Great Britain and Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia will be granted with armament systems, and Britain in exchange will get oil from Saudi Arabia. So I'm very happy that you mentioned the case, and the case is extremely important. But the case is not only important given the fact that it shows the level of bribes and commissions that are paid in order to push the Western armaments onto third world countries. It's also a deal that shows precisely how this trading mechanism functions, the trading mechanism between oil and arms, traded between oil and arms. Now, let me look at the time. I was very much tempted to devote a major section to the question of the threat of war on Iran. And this is, of course, a theme which is included as well in your book, and I think you bring out very, very important details on the risk of going to war in the eyes of right-wing research institutions, when you refer to the Heritage Foundation's investigation showing that if the American government decides to start war against Iran and the oil supply is cut off for 2 subsequent quarters, this would have very negative consequences for the US economy, according to right-wing institutions within the United States. Now, the other side of the picture, we shouldn't lose sight of. There are at least 3 ways in which the US military-industrial complex would have a strong interest in further militarization of the Middle East, and perhaps even in a direct war of destruction in which the US would directly participate. And I would like to at least cite these particular interests of the US military-industrial complex, because they illustrate the importance of Vijay Mehta's theme. The first is, of course, the major push for export of armament systems. And there are many cases from the newspaper reports that one could refer to. I'm not going to enumerate them. What I will just mention in this context is that Hillary Clinton, in one of her latest speeches, has referred to the US's great sympathy for developing a missile defense shield for the Middle East. And this is not coincidental, because one of the first major deals in that direction has already been signed by one of the US major arms corporations. So the US is pushing hard for the sale of missile systems towards Middle Eastern government, taking the argument that Iran is a threat, of course, on board as a major argument. There's a second reason why a war against Iraq, a direct war against Iraq, is perhaps not too far-fetched to visualize, which is the fact that there is minimalist pressure for the Pentagon to reduce its absolutely high level of armament expenditures. And although these reductions in our terms are very, very minor, these are very, very hard to digest for the corporations, the generals, and those who are operating the US military-industrial complex. Thirdly, we should also keep in mind that the US has a very strong interest in building a global defense industry, and that a war on the Middle East would help to consolidate such a global defense industry, in particular between US and European armament corporations. I'm not going to go into that in details now, but we should keep in mind that already there is an existence of a form of Atlanticism, which is a bit different from NATO, which has this the nature of very close cooperation between armament corporations based in the US and armament corporations based in Europe. I'll leave you the details for later. I'm going now to the concluding part of my statement, which is on the question of alternatives. And let me move on and see where yes. On the need to replace the military-industrial complex. I have carefully gone through the final part of the book, where Vijay Mehta pushed forward a number of suggestions in order to reduce the power of the military-industrial complex. And perhaps it's good to mention some of these, although you have already mentioned them in your speech, it's good to repeat them. There needs to be a global security architecture. There should be regional blocks of vulnerable states. We should emphasize multilateralism. And you have also referred in your book to the one case at least where a military and armaments cooperation has tried to reinvent itself as provider of wind energy. I'm citing from your book. Now, I was happy in particular with reference to the need for shifting towards a green economy. But let me first to emphasize the importance and the possibility of a shift away from the dramatic emphasis on armaments production. I'm getting a bit dried up. I would like to historicize this theme also a little bit. Because in the course of debating, we tend to forget. But in fact, the history of the debate of conversion goes back to at least to the beginning of the 1960s. And there was a very interesting essay at that time written by the very well-known economic theoretician Leontiev on the economic effects of disarmaments. I mean, Leontiev being the standard-bearer economist in the US, it was very significant that he wrote this particular essay in which he argued that while cutting military expenditures, though it would lead to elimination of substantial amount of jobs, twice as many jobs would be created through increased spending for domestic civilian purposes. So the argument that there is a lot to be gained from a shift away from the emphasis on armaments production has been made historically many times over. And it's perhaps good to recall that even in the US Congress, a bill at one point was tabled, 1964, where where the proposers of this bill argued that all military corporations should institute conversion committees, and that a part of the profits should be reserved to facilitate the transition in the US economy. So the debate on conversion is not new. The debate has to be revived. And it is very interesting to see that in the US there are certain efforts to revive the debate. Here I could refer to a study undertaken by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a very well-known group of economists led by Pauling, which focused in particular, it's a study published in 2007, which focused in particular on the effects of transfer of allocations towards, in particular, the war in Iraq to civilian purposes, educational purposes. And here again, the argument or the reasoning, the logic of the authors was very clear that this would not lead to a reduction in employment, but would lead to a positive effect for employment in the US economy. At least 600,000 to 1 million extra jobs would be created in consequence of such a shift. Now, it's a little bit a pity, if I may make a critical point, it's a little bit a pity that in the later part of your book, you don't situate yourself clearly within contemporary economic debates on the transition from the present neo-global economy. Because actually I think there is an occasion for peace activists to link up to debates on a shift towards green economics, where we have a very strong argument. We have a strong argument to include the issue of arms production into this debate. We know that there is, of course, a discourse where a number of economists say that it would be beneficial for Western economies to transit from reliance on fossil fuels towards reliance on alternative sources of energy. But in fact, the argument could be advanced from our side as peace activists, as critical economists, that in fact the transition could be strengthened by undertaking conversion of military industrial facilities towards domestic civilian purpose, towards domestic civilian purposes. I think I should leave it at that. I think the theme here is extremely important because we are faced with a global ecological crisis where we need to situate ourselves in terms of the reality of the world economy at this stage. And it's my conviction that the discussion on armaments, on the military-industrial complex, needs to be revived by taking a position alongside those who argue in favor of a transition away from the fossil fuel-based economy. I leave it at this. I have more points, but we can get to that in the debate. I hope this will suffice as a contribution to the debate
I'm sure
for today.
It will.
Thank you.
I'm very sure it will. Thank you. Well, I would like to invite now Mr. Karel Koster of the Scientific Bureau of the Socialist Party in the Netherlands. He's a specialist on foreign affairs and security issues.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this very interesting session, and also allowing me to comment on this very interesting book, which has come at a very correct point in time, as has been shown quite clearly by my illustrious predecessor. There's very little I can add economically to these comments, but let me twist everything around a little bit and bring something which, and I'm sorry to have to say it, bring a touch of political reality into the room, which I'm afraid I've missed in what has been said until now. Perhaps that's because of my work and because of the way I daily have to struggle and wrestle with the art of the possible, and knowing very well that we want something else and something wonderful. But I fear that in the book, and as well as Peter Custer's comments, I see too much of longing for something and too little of how to get there. And I'm going to try to point out some of the problems which are involved in that, because, of course, having said that, I would have to sort of, I'm sort of pretending I have an answer and I do not. So that's even more disappointing, I'm afraid. I'm just going to go into three kinds of, three matters. First is the analysis, which Vijay Mehta has given in his book, and the prime issue there, which I'm just going to get to in a moment. Then I will talk a little bit about political change and how things have to be changed, which is the point I was making just now. And a few problems involved in these change and creating or achieving some kind of political consensus on where we want to go. Having listened to all these details of how bad and it is a sort of moralizing and ethical comment on the military-industrial complex, one must automatically wonder why in heaven's name hasn't it changed? Because surely we would either have to assume that there is a massive support for this military-industrial complex, which means a lot of people are pretty rotten, or else there's apparently some other kind of mechanism at work which prevents change. And I think looking into that mechanism is very, very important. And this is the politics of this issue. And this has to do, I think, with the analysis, which I will say a little bit about. There is this issue of the military-industrial complex as an actor in the political process. And I think it's an old issue between Peter and myself as well on how the relationship is between the military-industrial complex and foreign policy. And I see a kind of easy sort of hopping onto from military-industrial complex and its description to a war policy, to foreign policy. I find it unconvincing. I do not think that the existence of the military-industrial complex itself can explain the way wars start, how foreign policy develops, how clashes of interest are solved. It is not sufficient. It is definitely one of the driving mechanisms, and it's been described most excellently in your book. And Peter Costas has a lot of things to say about it as well. But I do not accept that the military-industrial complex itself is a explanatory mechanism of how foreign policy works. And I believe that it is necessary to look at geopolitics and a nation state for that, and the way foreign policy develops from the competition between states in the international political mechanism. And I believe there is a case still to be made for state power. I do not believe that the state is a blind mechanism simply carrying out the will, whatever that may be, of the military-industrial complex. There is a definite interaction. There is a certain semi-independence of the state apparatus, and it is a very complicated one. And obviously there are many, many ties, as Eisenhower indeed already saw at the time, and as we've now been reminded of again. But I do not accept that this removes the autonomous function of the nation state, which is capable of deciding to go to war or not. And of course, with that, I also do not accept the idea that there is no, I would have to accept there's no possibility of influencing that. And I do not believe influencing that is a matter of social movements or action groups or social media. I'll have a few things to say about that just now. I believe this is also a matter of the institutionalized democracies and the way they work and whether they can be made to work. If we have reached a stage in time where they are no longer working, where institutionalized democracies, and now of course I am talking mainly about the Western world, the industrialized world, and the United States, if the democracies there are in a state of crisis and can no longer be influenced, then we are in big trouble indeed. As I said, there has been a there's at the moment a matter of a multipolar world. We had a bipolar world in the Cold War. In the post-Cold War, we had something of a unipolar world. And now we have a multipolar world, and the foreign policies of the nations involved clearly can be distinguished and clearly have different aims and are not simply driven by their military-industrial complexes. On the contrary, sometimes the military-industrial complexes are braked or damped down by certain foreign policies. So that means that we have an implication of this, because on the one hand, how to reach political change, how to change these relationships. If we think this mystical military-industrial complex has a political will and is actually moving and influencing everything, then it has to be met somewhere on an international level, which I think is an illusion. That will be clear from what I've already said. At the international level, you're talking about international institutions like the UN, and I believe it has already been said that the UN is, at the very least, in a process of corruption. If one can put it that way, it's a very moralistic way of putting it, but clearly there is the UN, and this is an old discussion of mine with many peace movement people. I've always thought that the UN can never be anything more than the sum, the average of the united power of the strongest states influencing it. And in some parts of recent history, that was a positive thing, and in other parts it was a negative thing. It has now come to the juncture where NATO is in direct contact with the UN Secretariat discussing policy. And it is these mechanisms that we must understand to decide in how to influence them. I do not believe that these things can be influenced by progressive movements at the level of the international institutions, not at the UN, not in New York, not in Geneva. It is useful to be present there, it is useful to lobby there. I do not believe they can be influenced there. I believe still the nation state is central, and you must find a solution to influencing the body politic in the different states across the world, whether it be India or whether it be Pakistan or whether it be Holland. And that means we must deal with the politics of each country separately. You must convince people there, if you are a movement, you must convince them that the points which have been made so eloquently about the military-industrial complex and the consequences for the world, you must convince them that the alternatives are the right ones. And if you cannot do that, then you've got a problem. I've got a problem too.
You're negative.
I'm realistic. And as I said at the start, I've looked very closely at the way politics works, and these are my conclusions. Occupy was a wonderful symbolical gesture which did not manage to contact the mainstream political opinion in, I think, any country which it was active in. It gave a beautiful signal, and then it died down, because it is obvious that if you want change, you must connect with this mainstream. If the mainstream cannot identify itself with the action groups, the